I want to introduce our opening panel here on this, as the future of the suburbs urban. And I'm delighted to have in particular two speakers, June Williamson, who literally co-wrote the books on retrofitting suburbia, and also Elizabeth Kneebone, who is the foremost scholar in the country, I believe, on the suburbanization of poverty. She's certainly the one I've learned the most on that subject from. We're also joined by the Black urbanist, Kristen Jeffers, and then our moderator, Diana Lind, who several of you saw on Tuesday talking about her book, Brave New Home. And with that, please take it away, Diana.
Thanks so much, Greg. And I'm really happy to be here moderating this discussion as well. It should be a really interesting conversation, some good perspectives on the future of suburbia and its connection to cities. Obviously, there's a lot of discussion right now about the fluidity of people between the sort of urban core and the suburbs. So we'll certainly talk about what COVID-19 means for the relationship between cities and suburbs. But I think there are also a lot of trends that were driving change before the pandemic. So we'll talk about those as well. As Greg mentioned, we have three amazing speakers here, and I'll just introduce them briefly. Kristen Jeffers, she's the founder and editor-in-chief of the Black Urbanist. Elizabeth Kneebone, research director for the Terner Center for Housing Innovation at Berkeley, and June Williamson, the chair and associate professor in Bernard and Ann Spitzer School of Architecture, City College of New York. Sorry, butchered that introduction there. But as Greg mentioned, also the author of Retrofitting Suburbia, very influential. So I thought that it would be important for us to start off our conversation by doing some level setting of, what is suburbia? How do we define the suburbs? And whether that is in opposition to the cities or in connection to them. And maybe we could do a little bit of a round here, everyone sort of contributing a bit to that definition. So I don't know who wants to go first, but maybe I'll call on you, June, if you want to go first, and we can go sort of in our clockwise order, perhaps, or counterclockwise, Kristen, then Elizabeth.
Okay, sure. Well, I think in my own research as an architect and an urban designer, when we're talking about retrofitting suburbia, we tend to kind of move out some of these ongoing debates that are looking at the macro level. To some extent, we know the suburbs are sub to the urb, so there's a geographic definition that they're on the periphery or on the outskirts or somehow are, sorry, a breeze just came through, an open window, natural ventilation, that they're defined in relationship to an urban core or center in some way. So there's a geographic idea, but in my own research, it also has to do with form. So we're looking at suburban places, suburban form, which people kind of know when they see it, and it's low density in the late 20th century and into the 21st century in Northern America. Low density, use separated through zoning, typically car dependent, and we know that people self-identify as suburban, or they're living in suburban or type neighborhoods, whether they're within the geographical kind of boundary of a city or a kind of non-incorporated area or something like that. But I think at this moment we understand that most North Americans live in urbanized areas, non-rural, and the majority of that is a suburban form type setting, even if it's within an incorporated city. So I'm starting with that.
Great start. Kristen, do you want to add some thoughts to that in terms of, I think we think about the suburbs and everyone thinks of a sort of typical thing, like sort of as June said, it when you see it, but the suburbs are really changing. And I wonder how you think about how the suburbs are, in fact, sort of surprising people's perceptions or misconceptions of what it could be.
I definitely think in the initial, when we're looking at how we built forms, the intent, especially when we talk about Northeastern and in some cases Midwestern legacy cities that have a clear, defined, dense urban core in form. And then you have other jurisdictions. You have developers who said, hey, I want to build tract housing and then, either include or disclude somebody. That definitely has an effect. And I think the other piece is now you have a lot of jurisdictions that have grown up a lot. They've built, at least in form, town centers. They've built a lot of homes. They've built apartments and townhomes and single family. They might have a few schools. They might have an overarching school district, so something that brings them together legally. Or they might have a homeowners association that brings them together legally. Or they might have been a PUD that grew up and said, well, we feel like a town. Let's get some papers together and incorporate. Or, unfortunately, there's the other situation. I'm sure Elizabeth's going to touch on this because of all her research on this, on the poverty piece of it. Places that get kind of left, where you have jurisdictions that have money and funding and collectivity. And it doesn't necessarily trend on race. There are a lot of different racial demographics in suburbs bringing themselves together to incorporate as towns. But then there are other places that don't have money, or they develop a reputation either for being crime ridden or have like some sort of nuisance, use and nuisance in the official definition of factories or health or something, and so they're just out there. And so they're kind of out there, unincorporated. They might have county jurisdiction. They might not have any sort of jurisdiction over them. And so people don't necessarily know who's gonna come when the ambulance is coming for them, or who's arresting them, or if whose taxes are they paying the taxes to. And so we might have that imagination of the picket fence, single family house, or if you lived in a very hard scrabble, high density, urbanized neighborhood, you move out to a less density area, but then maybe 5 or 10 years later, you're losing your chain stores. So
yeah,
I definitely see where there's that. Everybody has an idea of it, even if you're not necessarily the original demographic. There are Black created suburbs. I live in Prince George's County, Maryland. That's one of the most well-known sort of Black-led and sort of in the Black imagination, one of the top suburbs that people tend to aim towards, unless they're leaving the area and they're going back to low-density Sunbelt cities that pretty much look like that. Like I'm from Greensboro, North Carolina, which is pretty much a low-density Sunbelt city. And so sometimes it's urban when it's convenient. Like the area I live in is literally adjacent to the DC line. And so people still see it as DC, and it at one point had water and sewer connected to the district, but it was still very much Maryland. And so
yes, there's a lot of the suburbs are in flux.
Yes.
This will definitely be part of the discussion. And I think, and as you're saying, there are also new narratives coming out of the suburbs of what it is to live in a suburb, and how it is distinguished from the core city. Elizabeth, as we mentioned, you have done a lot of research on the suburbanization of poverty, and just sort of the ongoing kind of increased diversity of suburbs as well, that have really changed what we think of in suburbs. So curious on how would you add to this definition?
Yeah, I think the theme running throughout is there's a popular definition, there's a popular perception of what the suburbs are. And we've already heard the sort of common checkpoints: white picket fences, single family homes, low density, car dependent. I really leave it to Beaver to go really throw back with what do we think of as suburbia in the United States. And the thing about that is, there's no one statistical definition of what is a suburb, and that complicates all of these sort of discussions to be able to put your finger on exactly what it is. So we have this popular overarching feel of what it's supposed to be, but that has never been totally what the suburbs are. The suburbs have always been more diverse than that TV, personification of the suburbs. And I mean that in a few different ways. Like Kristen was just pointing out, and June has pointed to, that the jurisdictions themselves vary from really dense inner ring. Like you wouldn't even necessarily know you crossed the border from the city into the suburbs because it's a very dense form. You have then that all the way to the other end of the distribution of really exurban, basically pastoral rural feel. A lot of these, really far out bedroom type suburbs that, again, might have been rural a decade ago, 20 years ago. So you have the jurisdictions themselves that are really diverse, but the makeup of the suburbs has always been more diverse. Again, to just build on what Kristen was saying in terms of demographics, in terms of economics, there always has been a bit of a mix, more so than we've given them credit for. I think what's really come into sharper relief, particularly since the 2000s, is that the diversity has only increased. So now, if you think about our major cities and the remainder of the metro area that surrounds them, that we would call suburbs, again, that make up this big patchwork of places. For every major racial and ethnic group in the United States, the majority of those groups now live in the suburbs. We're a suburban nation, and that's true across racial and ethnic groups. It's also now the case that more poor people live in the suburbs than in big cities or in rural communities. So these are really big demographic and economic shifts that I think have drawn a lot of attention to something that was always somewhat the case, but now even more so. The suburbs are increasingly, that line between what is urban and what is suburban is blurring, and the gap is narrowing.
Yeah, that's great. And I think it plays into a bit of my next question here, which is about what role housing plays in terms of integrating all these various different demographics. So we know that historically there, were institutional practices of redlining, racism, segregation that kept suburban communities segregated. But nowadays, I'm curious to know what you all think are some of the barriers, particularly with respect to housing, in terms of having more integrated suburbs that provide more pathways to opportunity and also are more equitable. Who wants to take a stab? Yeah, I think June.
I'll start off.
Yeah.
I think we do have to look at the long historical arc of this, and I want to echo what's been said, that suburbs have always been more diverse than the popular perception or the stereotypes that come out of marketing. And there's a whole history of I think suburban history has been quite rich in recent decades to kind of unpack some of these things and the purposes of, like, the intents behind reifying these kinds of perceptions and stereotypes. And so unraveling and unpacking that is ongoing. It's not just that change has happened, but that the difference has always been there. So I think that's really an important point to emphasize. But when we look at the mass suburbanization period post-World War II, when a growth of the amount of built area in North America, which is now happening across the world, mostly on the periphery. That's where this kind of activity and changes really happened. A lot of that happened in the 20th century in North America. And it was quite homogenous in form, certainly. And then you begin now over time to be able to see some of the differences that have emerged. And I've got my color of law right here. The ways that we can access these stories. We can look at Levittown the iconic Levittown on Long Island, Nassau County by some measures, by Brookings measures, that's now an urban county, even though it's this like stereotypical suburban area. But Levittown has remained overwhelmingly non-Hispanic white, right? 70+%. Willingboro, which was the Levittown in New Jersey, where Herbert Gans lived and wrote the Levittowners, was integrated from the start because federal law changed. And it's now, I just looked it up again, it's 77% Black or African American. Same houses, same builder. Actually, the houses in Willingboro are better, bigger lots, a little better. The Willingboro houses, the Levittown houses today are worth more than twice as much. Wow. So they're over $200,000, the average house price versus the New Jersey. So what David Russ called a segregation tax in that wealth building, even when certain communities had access to home ownership, it has persisted. And these are corrosive things. So I want to just mention that. And those are two communities where the housing stock is quite homogenous. So one of the ways we can change, I think, when we think about design and built form is adding more choice and more mix and different types of housing in recognition of also the different households types and ways that people can perhaps leverage the properties they do have with accessory units or infilling 2 and 3 and 4 unit type buildings within what's otherwise that sacred R1 or 1 unit per lot kind of zoning. Or taking the shopping malls and the strip centers where there's all this underperforming asphalt, and you've got older populations, people who want to age in community and get rid of the 4-bedroom house, that they can move to new apartments and communities that can be built on that land that's just waiting for those opportunities, and maybe be walkable and mixed and more connected.
It's such an interesting idea. And also, I mean, I think that one of the barriers in those places where there is, those very homogenous housing types, it's very hard for those communities to imagine how they would incorporate more dense housing or more housing options, because they've sort of had, they've had this history of a homogenous housing type and very specific housing lots and so on. And so I think, barring some kind of statewide initiative to loosen the regulations around single family zoning, I think I would imagine it'd be very hard in these suburban areas to see either spot zoning variances that are granted or kind of major zoning changes there, just because they don't have the same kind of, say, like progressive politics of a Minneapolis or a Portland that is going to change its single family zoning. I'm curious to know, what you all think in terms of zoning as being a lever to push here. And how that really works in suburban areas where there's a little bit of a different, sometimes there are hired city managers rather than sort of, elected officials who are overseeing some of these suburban areas. So curious to see how you see single family housing changing in those places.
I'll just jump in to say, I think the zoning piece is necessary but not sufficient. Because you could even have a state come in and override and say, we're going to allow 4plexes on any currently single family owned lot. But if the processes of a locality don't change, that can still stymie the ability to develop. If they are throwing up a lot of barriers or making it a very timely and complex process to get through to develop, if the financing tools are not in place, that you can't make the development math work to actually get that construction started, then you won't really see any change, even if the zoning is conducive or amenable to this, modest density. Things won't shift. So I do believe it's a ground condition that needs absolutely is an important piece. It's like the base of the puzzle, but there has to be more to go along with it to really move that change. And I think you're pointing to a really important piece that isn't always visible or necessarily an explicit part of the conversation, which is the capacity amongst different jurisdictions. Because I think you do have what you could call, bad actors, obviously, in communities that are using their land use and housing and zoning policies to be exclusive, to opportunity hoard. But then there are other places that don't necessarily even know how all of the policies they have on the books interact in a way that affects the chances of building different kinds of housing, or may not have the capacity to try to have a pro-housing policy or designation. So I do think that capacity is a big piece of the puzzle in figuring out how do we move broader change or shifts to this landscape.
I see, Kristen, you're nodding your head a lot, and I wonder if there's specific things you want to add to this, broader question of how we can build more equitable communities, particularly in our suburban areas.
So absolutely, just education, and then also rethinking. Right, I tweeted an article from Strong Towns this morning that talked about why we go from underfunded, abandonment, specifically in some of our legacy Black neighborhoods that were gutted, specifically in DC, the ones that were gutted during the 1968 uprisings. And then you get to the point where now it's luxury retail, luxury real estate, and how the process, a lot of major developers want that complication because they don't want even small scale white-led developers to be in play. They don't want small actors. They don't want small places. They want to be able to do big and large and luxury because that's the return on investment. And they can say that they have these large sort of legacies. Whereas in our groups, we're talking about empowering people through home ownership. We're talking about empowering people through property, but we're at odds with each other because we are not looking. Now, there are groups of people who are looking at code review, who are reviewing zoning variances, who gets to get granted those. But on sort of the consumer, the average person level, helping people holding their hand through every step, especially young people. I'm a millennial, and of course there's a generation under me who is just getting to the point where if they're seeing us freaking out about not buying a house of our own, you can only imagine where their heads are at. It may not even be a thing, but what we could do, even in this socially distanced educational spaces, could be the perfect time to start teaching how has the housing world acted, using things like color of law and emphasizing that some of these things still happen, and then helping people understand this is how it's built right now, but this is how you can either make that system work for you, or you can completely change that system so it gets you to where you need to go. There are a lot of, one of the movements that's a Black-led movement, Buy Back the Block. There's a lot of education happening in communities that you may not expect education to be happening in around property ownership, fixing homes, home values. But then if the home values continue to increase, if there's a lot of work that needs to be done on these structures and you're already doing jobs, and then of course, real wage increases haven't happened, actual like formal educational barriers and credit scores, balancing entrepreneurship and raising families and family creation. All those things come together. All these sociological things do come together. But at the end of the day, we have a whole almost 2 generations now that are going to be spooked out of the idea that they'll ever be able to own a home or even build their own homes. Generations ago, people ordered homes from a Sears catalog. That's not happening anymore. Even if you wanted to, the regulation.
We may enter a day of people buying homes over the internet. I see that coming in the future. And certainly there's the whole iBuyer phenomenon happening where people are able to sell their homes. So anyways, just an interesting point. I see, June, you want to get
I just wanted to jump in here. I think one of the backbeats here, and this is maybe pulling back from kind of the weeds of how things are currently done and whether it's allowing, loosening R1 zoning and other things, to pull back and perhaps re-examine how much we've invested in home ownership itself as the primary wealth building engine in our society, with tax breaks and all of the subsidies that are indirect and direct that have been associated with this that we've naturalized, right? And then the highways and all the rest of it. And how could we trouble that? I live in Manhattan and I rent, but we have this general perception that renting is a lower income kind of lesser status, and yet it can increase mobility and loosen up resources for other kinds of investments. However, our tax policy penalizes that choice or doesn't. You don't have the same kind of incentives. So these are things also that could be challenged when we think about housing and the suburbs and mobility patterns and different types of households. And we've had this dramatic increase in 1 and 2 person households that to some degree is associated with longevity. People are living long past their child rearing years, for which this sort of mass suburbanization was built for and planned around and oriented towards consumer needs and all the rest of it. So 1 and 2 is not. Some people also are just, choosing not to have children or have different kinds of households. And how do we unlock all the opportunity associated with that and connect it to our built environment in ways that people could perhaps reduce their housing costs and open up resources for other things?
I'm excited for you to read my book because it touches on a lot of these similar issues of demographic trends, and how there's a mismatch between the people that we have and the housing that we have, and then also sort of gets in the conclusion to the way that our sort of current models of home ownership are broken in terms of how that does also lead to inequity in terms of wealth being, if you're not able to own a home in the US, your options in terms of wealth creation are really limited. And we're seeing, to Kristen's point, a whole generation of people who are really essentially locked out of that opportunity. So we really need to be thinking about what opportunities, what other ways we might be able to build wealth. And there's a question that came over the chat that sort of relates to this. And I think, also brings us to some of these questions about what's going to happen during coronavirus, post-coronavirus, in terms of our communities. One of the questions that came over was that the 2008 crash began to change the housing landscape, particularly in so-called suburban areas. Many corporations, for-profit and nonprofit, bought large numbers of single-family houses for rental purposes. Is this good or bad for middle-class families? And actually, during the networking session that happened on Tuesday with Greg, he asked me, what do you think about this worst case scenario in terms of there being this wave of evictions, and what will that mean in terms of who owns these homes, particularly in suburban areas? Sorry, I don't know why I got lost there. But what you see happening in terms of the housing stack as a result of, potentially this wave of evictions. And then also, I wonder how you see the suburbs either taking advantage or, struggling with its infrastructure, if you will, in terms of, how the suburbs provide social services because of the lack of density, or is it going to be a case where the suburbs really are able to take advantage of, like June was mentioning, those large asphalt parking lots that are really great for ghost kitchens and delivery services from chain retail. So curious if how you all see the next couple of months playing out, both in terms of home ownership of single family homes and then also just the infrastructure in suburbs. So go ahead.
I definitely think we're going to see some dramatic changes. We're going to have to. It's already happening. There are a lot of people there are a lot of people across all demographics who've admitted to not paying their rent since March. They've been able to ride on these what we thought were going to be forgiveness plans. And we may need to see that because we may need to take some of these bigger places and bigger entities. We're going to have to prepare for financial loss here because there's just no way that that's going to be recovered. Otherwise, we're going to see a lot of homelessness, disease, and things we just don't want to see. All the work we did to stay at home and shelter in place, of course, the line was that we were going to hold off the hospital capacity, but there's other things that were at play here that are going to all the things we were working on to provide affordable housing, that the threshold has changed because so many more people are going to need that help. The AGIs and all those things that we use on paper, having to file taxes to prove how much money you make, how you may have been making that a year ago, but now there's so many people are at zero. And so I feel like our next panel is really going to dig into that fact that we have so many people at zero right now. But I think absolutely everything that June and Ellen wrote in that book, y'all's books over the years about being able to recycle everything from that empty Walmart to that empty parking lot. We can always, of course, we've been encouraged to put up tents, to put out furniture outside, to offer socially distanced everything from health scans to COVID testing to dining to library services. And then one other thing I want to say before I yield the floor in this question is that we cannot assume that, especially if you have a cluster of housing, And if you haven't already agreed as a cluster of housing that you're just living in a neighborhood that just happens to be on an old farm and you want to be out in the way and you don't really want that level of support. But if you are in a jurisdiction that has a lot of people, that you basically have been acting as if you are a legacy city or a major entity like that, you have to provide the services. Otherwise, if you don't want to see the devastation, if you don't want ugly images, if you don't want public shame as a jurisdiction, find a way and be creative and look to all your nonprofit providers, your houses of faith, your artists, collectives, people who have been used to providing aid and mutual aid to themselves. Otherwise, there's no getting around the disaster, not just the physical disaster of abandoned homes and people dying in homes or whatever, but you're going to want to avoid that PR disaster of being known as a place that did not take care of its people during a major time of need.
And I'll just add on to that idea of being able to provide the services that are going to be critically needed in the coming months. That in suburbs, the way this is going to play out is going to vary so widely in the ability to marshal those sorts of resources, because already we're starting from a really uneven playing field from the types of infrastructure and support systems that are in place, in part because many suburbs are quite small. You may be talking about a jurisdiction with 12,000 people, 20,000 people. So they already have a limited budget and resources to draw from. They may not have the same nonprofit infrastructure, often don't have as many providers or as a robust safety net continuum for when people fall on hard times or need help weathering these sorts of downturns. And this one, this is a very unprecedented in recent, modern memory kind of downturn that we're in. So I think there's going to be this challenge. Already you're starting from a very different baseline across the suburban landscape, and people, the tax rolls of all of these communities have been hit because as people have lost their jobs and are unable to pay their taxes, there are also going to be those implications on the ability to even just fund the types of sources that they may have been able to provide in the past. And this is all to say, and I know that the next session is really going to dig into this more, like what happens when the rent's due. The federal assistance has been critical in getting us this far, through these many months without seeing a worse picture emerging. And even still, we know that households are making all kinds of trade-offs, especially those that haven't been able to get unemployment insurance or to connect to the aid that's been made available. That the pulse data coming out of the census is showing that renters are having to some degree turn to things like credit cards or borrowing from family and friends. They're tapping into their own savings and depleting their own personal safety nets and cushions to be able to get through this period. And now with the second wave of shutdowns coming, how long does this period last? So that's all to point to, and I know that the next section is going to get into this more. Localities and states don't have the resources to do this all on their own. This really is going to require some significant federal assistance if we want to stabilize communities and keep people in their homes and not worsen the homelessness crisis that already so many communities were facing even before the pandemic.
I just want to second that entirely. And in New York, I work for the state of New York City College, keeping all of the public sector workers employed as well, and directing aid at the state and local level to maintain the jobs of the people who are then providing those services is crucial. And then there's the physical side. So throughout metropolitan areas, there are these opportunities in the parking lots, the vacant strip malls, now we've had this cascade of new bankruptcies in the commercial or retail sector. And so there are these building shells that could be used in various ways. In New Jersey, the American Dream Mall, which would have been the biggest shopping mall in North America had it fully opened, was immediately repurposed as part of the crisis here in Metro New York around COVID. And so the physical location, the centrality of some of these, some of the suburban sprawl, non-residential uses could be co-opted for temporary housing as well, perhaps even in tents or other sorts of places that could be installed to all kinds of other things. So I think we may see that in a temporary sense, which interestingly, there's a lot of debate about tactical urbanism and so on, and these kind of short-term mock-ups to spread that kind of idea into other areas that then could lead to perhaps more long-term reimagining of the form and connectivity and mix of uses and kind of where people go for things could be a result over time, possibly.
Sorry that I seem to have had an internet problem there and was off the screen for a moment, but I wanted to ask a question that came in over the chat, which gets back a little bit to some of our questions about home ownership and the divide between renters and homeowners. The question was, why not create lease-to-own options, tenant interim leasing, where you can convert renters to homeowners where they live and work? That's definitely something that, along with community land trusts, could be within the realm of options. And I think that we also have not really tried very much to use government-owned land or housing as a way to create home ownership for those renters. I just wondered if you all had any thoughts about that, of how that also might potentially ease some of the issues and inequality between renters and homeowners in the country. I don't know if anyone wants to take a stab at that.
I'll speak a little bit to that. I think we need a lot of different creative solutions just like that, and that's not a one size fits all thing. People have asked, and I've thought about it myself. What if because ultimately, if those of us who are many of us who are on this panel know this, we all technically are renting our space. Mm-hmm. When we purchase a home, we purchase land rights for however long we live, and we don't necessarily pass those land rights down to family members, and we don't necessarily get full ownership of having that space. If you're still paying on a mortgage and you foreclose, then you lose that access to that land. If you are in a jurisdiction that charges you property tax for access to that land, or ground rent, which is the case still in Baltimore City, you can lose access to that land. And so just like those are mechanisms that were put into place and they may or may not make sense for people, we absolutely need more mechanisms that make sense. Getting back to that education, working with people who say, I would love to stay in X place, open a business here, or I have, or in some cases, people need to live in certain cities because they have different abilities. There's certain areas that are more accessible if you use mobility devices. Specifically here in DC, we have a lot of the deaf community that's here because of Gallaudet University, and it's one of the metro areas that's geared towards that. And then there's still very much racism, sexism, and even some heterosexism in how communities are based. There are neighborhoods that will not, even though this is illegal, but we'd have to go to court to prove that in some jurisdictions, that me and my partner not being able to get a home, either purchase or rent, is illegal. And then there's still going to be people who look at our color and say, we're not sure that you're a good fit for this area. But we all know that can happen immediately. You have to go to courts sometimes to prove that. You can't just say, hey, this person's being racist or homophobic. There's a time period, and sometimes there's money involved in proving that this is what happened. And I'm a middle class. My partner and I are both middle class people. We work, we have college degrees that helps us out, but there's so many people who don't have that time and space. And even if they do, and then on top of this, now we have a pandemic. So we need, whether it's rent to own, whether it's teaching people how to build themselves, whether it's teaching people how to leverage things like warehousing, or understanding all the different instruments that are out here now to obtain home, like property, residential property, as well as, and not just for one family, but multifamily residential properties, and the abilities to turn commercial property back and forth into residential. much like I see in the comments, the malls have shifted. Some of them have shifted immediately. What June was saying about that American Dream Mall. We absolutely need all these different solutions, and there's solutions we haven't even thought of yet that incorporate the social issues that come up around who gets to obtain property and keep it and do so fairly.
Yeah. Oh yeah, sure. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, I think some of these ideas, really inventive ideas, are what we're going to need right now. And there's an opportunity perhaps for things that have been thought about, but not had as much sort of incentive to implement and test out. I think we also, and Elizabeth probably knows a lot more about this. We have to be very wary of these things being subject to abuse, because new inventive ideas, there's a whole other group of people just looking for opportunities to exploit those new openings, and whether it's contract sales, and apparently that's reemerged in Atlanta, which is really troublesome and worrisome. But people are being enticed into signing these things, and other things like that. So keeping an eye out for potential abuses, so that the promised opportunities are realized. So.
Yeah, I +1 to that. I think that's right. And to what Kristen said as well. Like we should be exploring what are the sort of innovative, inventive ideas that could scale. But if we scale them, how do we do it in a way that doesn't become predatory or wealth stripping for the people that we're trying to help? And also in that vein, I think some of these models hold a tension in them and a question that is maybe this is the perfect time to grapple with it, about using. Do we see home ownership? What is the primary goal of home ownership? Is it wealth building or is it housing stability? Because those can be in tension with each other when you think about how do you create affordable options in perpetuity, or is it about getting a household housed in a home ownership situation so they can experience some of that wealth building? And I think these are solvable, but it is something that has to be sort of intentionally grappled with up front for what we're trying to achieve to design them, I think, the most effectively.
So when talking about how the suburbs are, again, certainly getting a lot of attention in the media as being new places of choice. I think, June, you mentioned that there was a story about how New Yorkers want to live in Montclair, New Jersey, as sort of, this example of, what the ideal suburb might be. It's walkable, it's diverse, and so on. It's also clearly a suburb for people who are, who may not have to commute on public transportation into the city as an essential worker, or, may not be a place that, frankly, when we think about other types of suburbs, like the Ferguson, Missouri example of what suburbs are, it's a very different type of picture. And I wondered, what you see in terms of this kind of, urbanization of the suburbs looking like, in terms of, are people are looking for these small downtowns that are walkable and have maybe, urban-like amenities within them. But we're also, there aren't that many of those Goldilocks, suburbs of choice out there. I wonder if you could speak to that a little.
Yeah, I'll just take that up a little bit. Certainly, we're seeing stories in New York of people that home sales that the real estate industry is booming in some of the revitalizing or redeveloping small towns in the Hudson Valley, north of the city, where people with means might have had weekend or second houses, and they're choosing to move to those places full time, or kind of model suburbs like Montclair, which have a long history of being racially integrated, or at least having difference within them, have mass transit, have a walkable town with cafes and restaurants and shops. And a lot of people in New Jersey work in New Jersey. Majority of people in New Jersey work in New Jersey. So the commutes might vary. But we're seeing this sort of mini trend of people who maybe have been thinking about it for a while, millennials who've started families and they've been in an apartment and feeling squeezed. And so now is the time they're acting on things they might have been thinking about for a while. That seems to be what's going on. But what it speaks to, I think, is an ongoing trend of the sort of value and desire for urban type places in the suburbs. So some of the amenities people have been used to in their neighborhoods in Brooklyn or elsewhere, where prices have been very, very high for the space, to try and find things that have similarities at a smaller scale. And there's this kind of polycentric. There are places throughout a lot of metropolitan areas that have those qualities, but they're becoming, and they have been and are becoming, highly desirable. So then you get into the issue of whether they're affordable for a range of people, which then you've got to get different types of apartments and things into them. Does this mean there's like this going to be an overall exodus out of the cities for places like New York, where real estate prices have been very high? We've had population growth and so on. I don't see that happening.
I was going to say, and I didn't crystallize my question very well, but I think, when people say that these are urban downtowns, it's a very slice of what they mean by urban. It's, right. It's that mix of use, the sort of nice shopping street of a city versus what you might see in a lot of other cities, which might be a commercial corridor that isn't beautiful or booming, but is a real space for a lot of cities. So I think that there's something happening in terms of the coding of how we think of that as being an urbanized space, but we wouldn't necessarily say that some other suburb that has, again, a walkable downtown, but doesn't have, say, fancy restaurants or nice boutiques. Yeah. So urban.
To elaborate on that, there's this one idea of urban, which is that mixed use, walkable, and there's this kind of growing market explosion for walkable places, walkable urban places that might be located in suburbs. And the retrofitting trend certainly speaks to making more of those. So not just sort of revitalizing those older main streets and so on, but building them to some degree up from scratch. But there's this other side that has to do with the coding associated with the word urban. So we get these conundrums. On the one hand, the suburbanization of Manhattan. Like, what does that mean? That means the emergence of chain stores and retailers, the stuff you'd find in a suburban mall, kind of taking over what should be diverse and funky and so on. So that's in a kind of more of an ideological sense, and it's usually meant pejoratively, right? That the suburbanization of an urban retailer area is negative, and then conversely, the urban suburb, and that's coded in terms of a cultural, usually means more Black people there, and geographically that's not related. Ferguson, Missouri, and we talked a bit about this yesterday, and there's a whole smattering of suburbs around St. Louis that have significant Black populations, and some of that has to do with the exodus when public housing was closed and displacements and people being shifted. And so then you have these peripheral areas that are under-resourced, have significant fraction within their small towns, smaller populations, don't have the services that Elizabeth was talking about, and they're coded as urban suburbs because of who lives there, I think.
Yeah, I just to add on to that, and sort of speculate a little bit. Sorry if you can hear my 5-year-old howling in the background. Just to speculate a little bit on, like, what does COVID mean? What does this moment mean for the suburbs? To June's point about Montclair, about this sort of, or the narrative that we hear emerging about the desirability of the suburbs, or people taking this moment, people with means now taking this moment to go to these choice suburbs and make that move. One, maybe a positive thing might be a demand for more of the sort of retrofitting and building up of density and walkability and connectivity, if the market's really seeing that is something that is moving right now. I mean, there may be small sort of spillover effects about pushing up prices in those places, and again, determining who gets to live there based just on who can afford those sorts of choice places. But then you can run the gamut down to, you mentioned Ferguson or some of these smaller suburbs who may have been experiencing disinvestment or distress over a longer period of time, who may also, because one thing we've seen along the side of suburbanization of poverty more generally is the growth of concentrated poverty in the suburbs. So poor people living in very poor neighborhoods or very poor, poor suburbs. And those communities often tend to have concentrations of low-wage workers who are going someplace else to work in low-paying jobs, and may often be frontline workers or essential workers who are in a community that doesn't have the resources and doesn't have the capacity, but may be having their residents particularly impacted by this current moment. So I think, again, what does this mean for the future of suburbia is going to really play out very differently depending on the sort of starting resources and built environment within those places. And again, this is all speculation. We'll see how this all plays out in real time. But I do think thinking about these questions is an important call for policy and how we think about what kinds of resources or services might need to be arrayed in different suburban contexts, or even can we think about these suburbs with the walkability and maybe some diversity of housing stock and populations? Are there measures those communities should be taking right now to preserve some of the affordable housing stock or naturally occurring housing to make sure that those places continue to be available to a diverse array of people and households and communities?
Diana, can I ask a follow-up question to Elizabeth? And one of the things that certainly has come up a lot in my research is the potential, but the difficulty of this patchwork of suburban jurisdictions cooperating together and working regionally. Do you think there's a real opportunity to kind of rethink some of that resource sharing and responsibility in this context?
I do, and I think we've seen some places trying to do that, and especially, again, something I've been on the lookout for right now, because in the wake of the last recession, when the foreclosure crisis really hit, and it hit suburban communities, just given the housing-led nature of it, we saw more this very fragmented landscape, and that fragmentation often gets in the way of more scaled and cooperative responses. We saw suburban communities starting to work together to try to attract resources, to think about housing and community development needs, again, particularly places that needed to stabilize neighborhoods and larger communities because of the foreclosure crisis. We pointed to Ferguson a number of times, but the Normandy School District actually has one of these collaboratives. It's called 24 in 1, because there are 24 jurisdictions within this one school district. So, Kristen, you mentioned governing structures that might band places together. They use that footprint to then get these suburban communities to collaborate and try to plan together, share resources together around key development issues and needs. So I do think that scale question is something that really has to be addressed, given the varying resources and the fact that we talk about urban and suburban, how they're linked. Metropolitan regions, right, are kind of sink or swim together. It's not like you can have one part of your region suffering and becoming disinvested and dealing with these sorts of mounting challenges and think that the whole region's going to thrive as much as it could if we all took those investments and worked in a more cross-jurisdictional way.
Yeah, one last thing I want to say before we close out. Basically, we learned how to say urban and suburban. It was written in the real estate documents. It was written in the newspapers. We have learned new language before. And so I want us to be centered on language. I did not call my site the Urbanist for a reason. And to play on that trend in the words, it is the Black Urbanist for a reason, because there is a separation. We are people, and it is okay to name the people who you're aiming towards. But then also don't just stick with one key group. That coalition of people, there are lots of coalitions that have already formed while you were waiting on the funding or on the time. We also can't assume that even though the demographics say you're low wage, you're poor, and you're going somewhere else, that there aren't community networks that are forming. So think about the language that we use in our documentation, in our policy, in our media sources. We're losing some media sources, but there's room for new ones to pick up and do things better and distribute information. And finally, just, I think, to be honest, to answer the question we started with, that it's not necessarily urban or suburban. The future is metro, and how we choose to fix whatever problems each section of the metro region has. But recognizing metro regions live and die together. You can't have a weak link and then have strong areas and then not stay that way forever.
Well, we could keep on talking, I'm sure, for a much longer time, but I really appreciate the conversation with you all. And if we had sort of a big round of applause from the audience, I'm sure they would appreciate it as well. But thank you all so much for joining in this conversation. And I think the next panel should be up in just a moment, but thanks all so much.
Thanks, Diana.
Yeah, thank you.